Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the 11 studio albums recorded by Australian rockers Midnight Oil. Now, you probably know Midnight Oil best from their 1987 worldwide smash Beds Are Burning, which is still played on the radio today, but there's a lot more to these guys than that one-hit wonder. They formed in 1972 as a band called The Farm. And then they played the bar and beach circuit up and down the east coast of Australia before becoming Midnight Oil in 1976 and then releasing their debut album on their own label in 1978. They're very, very politically active. They're tireless campaigners for the environment, for nuclear disarmament, for Aboriginal rights, and many, many other causes besides. This is a band that really does walk the walk, to the point that their lead singer, Peter Garrett, left the band in the early 2000s to become a politician, controversially. They have, though, since reformed about 4 years ago, and they've done 2 world tours, and there's even talk of some new material. The longest running lineup is the lineup that reformed, which is Peter Garrett on vocals, Martin Rotzi and Jim Magini on guitars, Rob Hurst on drums, and Bones Hillman on bass guitar. But 11 albums, let's get straight into it. Number 11 from 1996, their 9th album, Breathe. This is a dark, grungy, claustrophobic record. Even the cover is quite sort of lo-fi and unappealing. Malcolm Burns' production is dry. I think it's deliberately undercooked. I really like the opener, Underwater, but from there on things start to drag quite early on. I think the quality of material just isn't up there with their best stuff. There's not a lot of joy going on, and they don't sound like they're having a tremendous amount of fun on this record. At number 10, from 2002, their 11th album, Capricornia. This is much more polished than the 2 previous albums before it. It sounds a bit more like mid-period Midnight Oil. And when I say that, I mean the sort of period you'd know from Beds Are Burning, that kind of thing. Which isn't surprising because it's produced by Warren Livesey, who did those albums. The clean guitars, the acoustic guitars are back. Golden Age, I think, is a passable single. And the rest is all very listenable and pleasant without being that exciting. It went top 10 in Australia, but it didn't do anything in the rest of the world, and that just goes to show you that their stock had risen, and by this point it was very much on the slide again. At number 9, from 1998, their 10th album, Redneck Wonderland. This is the heaviest album. It's almost sort of quite industrial sounding in places. It was interestingly, though, it's produced by Warren Livesey, with whom they had their biggest commercial successes. There are a lot of thick, distorted guitars on here. There's a lot of noise. I'm not hearing that much melody. I do like Cemetery in My Mind and Seeing is Believing. I think they're pretty good songs. And as always, it's heavily, heavily political. But a good yardstick of an album, I think, is always how many of the songs from that album do they carry on playing on subsequent tours? And the answer to that question is almost none of them. At number 8, though, things start to get really interesting because it's their debut album from 1978, released on their own label, Powderworks. Eventually their stuff was taken over by Columbia and they released all the subsequent stuff. This had Andrew James on bass guitar. And straight out of the box, you know, the album's it's full of inventiveness. It's quirky. I think one of the best ways to describe it is a kind of prog punk. Proggy because, you know, there are a lot of changes in the songs and some of them are quite long, but punky because you've got that real kind of fiery anger in the playing and the delivery and the political stance the band is taking. There's energy, there's edge, and there's even bit of melody sort of scattered about here and there. It's quirky, and you can hear this is a unique band straight away. The big sticking point is Peter Garrett's voice. It's very much a Marmite voice, or a Vegemite voice if you're watching in Australia. Some people hate it. Some people like it. And I have to admit, it does take a little bit of getting used to. But it is at its most sort of divisive on this album, certainly. But if you can get past it, there is a world of musical joy you can have with Midnight Oil. Powderworks, Head Over Heels, Used and Abused, Run by Night, all really, really good songs. It's a really good record. I like it. And at number 7 is the album that came just after it from 1979, their second album, Head Injuries. And you could hear almost immediately the band is learning. The songs are leaner and tighter straight away, and the singing is better. And this is an important point. Peter Garrett's singing gets better and better with every record. There's some really good songs on here. Back on the Borderline, Cold Cold Change, No Reaction. Again, a lot of songs they still play live to this day. It only dented the top 40 in Australia, but the band was gaining recognition, but clearly by no means were stars yet. This was Andrew James, bass player Andrew James's last record, because he left the band due to illness, to be replaced by Peter Gifford for a few records. At number 6, Earth and Sun and Moon from 1993, their 8th album, produced by Nick Launay. This is a return to a sort of more natural, slightly less compressed, open sound. The 2 albums before this had been their 2 big commercial hits, and I think it was time that they felt they should move on sonically. So as I say, there seems to be a sort of sonically just a bit more space in this record for me. There's a brilliant song on this album called True Ganini, one of the Midnight Oil's very best songs. In the Valley's also great. My Country's great. The album's a bit overlong. I think they probably could have shaved about 10 minutes off. It's about 50 minutes long, this record, so they could have done without 10 minutes or so and made it an even leaner, more lovely record, I think. But number 5 from 1990, their 7th album, Blue Sky Mining. Blue Sky Mining was the follow-up to Diesel and Dust, their huge international hit, the one that had Beds Are Burning on it. And it's very much like a brother-sister record to that one. It's again produced by Warren Livesey. It has very much a similar kind of sound. It was the same producer. And there are some really good songs on here. There's no doubt about it. Blue Sky Mine, Forgotten Years, King of the Mountain. They were all hits, and they're all great pop rock songs. This album went top 5 in many countries, and it's still as political as ever. And that's a good trick, you know, being so overtly political and still appealing to so many people, because of course politics is such a divisive issue. There's even a song on here about an asbestos controversy. But there's also tenderness on this record. Stars of Warburton is a lovely song, which kind of thing we don't necessarily expect from Midnight Oil. This album could have been higher, but I just felt it was more of the same as Diesel and Dust. And I always like hearing a band pushing themselves and moving on to different sounds and things. But number 4, from 1981, their 3rd album, Place Without a Postcard. This is where the band start to get really interesting. They came to London. Their record company, by this point, the band was on the rise. The record company wanted a hit single for them to break through, so they gave them Glyn Johns, legendary producer from the Stones and the Who, and engineer with Led Zeppelin. And so they all decamped to Sussex to record this album. But tensions arose between producer and band, and the weather wasn't great. It was raining, and there was a lot of pressure on the musicians to deliver that hit single. What's interesting is they delivered completely the opposite to that, because the sound of this record, it's kind of muddy. It's not that clear. The sound is weaker, but you have to say the songs are just getting better and better. There's some brilliant songs on this album. I Don't Want to Be the One, Basement Flat, Brave Faces, I absolutely love. And again, of course, the usual overtly political stuff like Armistice Day. They are moving towards a sort of poppier approach, and it's really working because they're not losing the crashing guitars and the energy and the attack and the dynamism that they play with, particularly live. They are a ferocious and wonderful live band, by the way. And number 3, from 1984, their 3rd album, Place Without a Postcard. 1984, their 5th album, Red Sails in the Sunset. This was recorded in Tokyo, and it ended up becoming their first number 1 album, and their first album to enter the American Top 200. Again, the record company was still looking for those hit singles, but the band did a 180-degree turn on what they'd just done with their previous record, which had been a success, and I love that. The band just refused to kowtow to the record company. They were going to do what they wanted to do. This ends up being a strange record because you've still got the crashing guitars, but the drums are produced a little bit differently, slightly more processed sound on the drums, but they're still played. Everything's still played with such a ferocity. You've got Kosciuszko, best of both worlds. I mean, the guitars are squealing away, but you've got lovely arrangements and sweet harmonies and great backing vocals, driving beats, and impassioned lyrics. It's kind of a record like no other. This, I can't think of many I can compare it to. But if you like Midnight Oil, then this is one well worth investigating. At number 2, though, from 1987, the big one, their 6th album, Diesel and Dust. So Warren Livesey had worked with Julian Cope and so he seemed a pretty good fit, and so it proved, because this was a huge hit worldwide, Diesel and Dust. Really, that success coming off the back of the singles Beds Are Burning particularly, but also The Dead Heart, which is a great song. There's a commercial sheen to this record that really did sort of pay off. Rolling Stone named it one of the albums of the year and 13th best album of the whole of the entire 1980s. And it's not hard to see why. It's so full of massive choruses. You've got Beds Are Burning, of course, The Dead Heart, Sometimes, Sell My Soul, Warrakerna, Put Down That Weapon. Just song after song. I don't think there's a bad song on this album at all. What people don't necessarily know about this record is it's a concept album about the plight of the Aborigines, and that's a really neat trick to squeeze that into an album that sold this many copies worldwide. A lot of people regard it as one of the greatest Australian records ever made. I think, listening now, the production possibly has dated a little bit. It's an 80s record in a really, really good way, but almost all 80s records still sound dated to one degree or another, I think. But the strength of the material really does hold up. It went top 20 in many, many countries. 20 got to 21 in the US, and this was the album that really did put Midnight Oil on the world map at last. But let's get to number 1, and it is appropriately enough called 10-9-8-7-6-5-4-3-2-1, or to some people 10-1, or to some people Countdown. The band returned to England with Nick Launay, and they recorded in the Townhouse, and I don't know what was in the air when they recorded this, but I want some, because I want all my records to sound like this. It really just has a ferocity to it, and an anger to it, but at the same time it's just blessed with so many wonderful choruses. You've got Power and the Passion, which was a huge hit and is still something of a classic in Australia. But US Forces, Only the Strong, Read About It. These are songs they still play live, and honestly, watching these songs play live is just it's quite an experience. They're great songs. They're songs that are just meant to be shared with an audience, people just getting caught up in the moment and screaming those choruses at the top of their lungs while the band blasts away. It's just joyous. David Frick, the writer, said this sounded like the end of the world turned up to 10. And but there's also sort of chilling, haunting songs on here like Screamin' Blue. And really, if you are not one of the initiated, this is one of the great lost rock music albums of all time. And for a few pounds or dollars and pence, you could do a lot worse than investigate this record and see if you like it or not, because if you do like it, you will soon love it very, very quickly. This is the album that sort of broke them in Australia, certainly, particularly with the single Power and the Passion. And Australia, the pub rock scene, the highly charged guitars, Cold Chisel, Jimmy Barnes, AC/DC, they slotted into all of that, but at the same time there was more to them. The arrangements were more complex, and of course the lyrics were infinitely more political than most of those other bands. 7 times platinum, this album went in Australia. It was on their charts there for 170 weeks, and many people regard this as the greatest Australian record made of all time. And if you do like your highly charged guitars and impassioned approach by a band, then I strongly recommend you check this record out. You won't regret it. Elsewhere in the Midnight Oil canon, you've got a couple of really good EPs. Bird Noises, they made early on in their career, which has got Wedding Cake Island on it, No Time for Games, a couple of great songs. And also Species Deceases, which has Hercules on it, which is something of a Midnight Oil classic to this day. They've also made a couple of live albums, particularly Armistice Day, which is a live album they made of their recent world tour, and you get a really good sense of the ferociousness and energy and excitement of a Midnight Oil concert. I think if you are interested in Midnight Oil, then certainly 10 to 1 is the place to start. But as with most of these lists, the top 3, 4, 5 albums here are all very, very good. Anyway, that is my rundown of Midnight Oil. If you are a fan in Australia, I'm probably just preaching to the converted and telling you what you already know, and I apologise. But for those of you who have learned something today, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will look forward again to seeing you for another Rock Records Reviewed soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.